Good morning, teachers. I just want to take a second to talk about the traditional barriers just to make sure that you have them for your research paper. I mean, just your understanding, obviously, also. But when you're writing about your research, when you're writing about your benchmark, you're going to want to talk about the fact that you selected these. So let me just stop for a second. When I went through program learning about instructional technologies, a lot of the technologies, and of course this was so early, there were no apps, were no, very few websites. We were learning about tools that we don't have, that the teachers don't have access for. So two of the main ones I learned about were Flash. Okay, first of all, Flash has a learning curve, very, very steep learning curve. In addition to that, that whole Dreamweaver suite, which we learned about, is very expensive. And we learned about Photoshop. Okay, that's another tool that's very expensive. And most teachers don't have access to those two things. The final one that I'll mention is Inspiration and Kidspiration, which is, I think at the time, was about $50 to $70 per computer, so per station. In schools, again, they're not going to spend, even if you're just talking about a computer lab with 25 computers in it, most of them aren't going to spend $50 to $70 on one piece of software. So I try to focus on, and I share with you, tools that are free. The only one, if we were in class, and we won't look at it this year because we're not in class, is the smartboard. Not everybody will necessarily have access to the smartboard, but everything else I show you is free. Therefore, you have access to it. And that is the number one barrier that IRTMR addresses. The first order barriers is teachers don't have access, and students don't have access to technologies or certain technologies, and generally that's due to cost. It's the reason we're using Chromebooks as opposed to MacBooks. MacBooks, I think anyone would agree that MacBooks are a better technology. They're going to last longer. This is from someone who has Dells, and I use PCs because schools use PCs. It's better, but the reason we don't use them, or iPads, is because of cost, because they're so much more expensive. You could buy, probably 6 Chromebooks for the cost of one MacBook. Next one is lack of time to plan, or just lack of time in general. Someone has already mentioned in one of my classes about the fact that they don't have time to look at all of the technologies that are available. Think of all the apps that are available. Don't have time because you're so busy doing everything else. If you're talking about your plan period, then you have an hour, 50 minutes a day, and that includes getting your grading done and preparing for the next class. Okay, so where does the time come? Lack of training. I don't think that's as big a problem as it once was, but I think it is because there might not necessarily be any you do have to complete so many professional development hours per year, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in technology integration. So lack of training on how to use tools. That's why it's important for you to remember that there are multiple conferences that go on in the summer. We have the IFL conference here at Bellarmine that's free to you as a student. We have the Teach Tech Learn conference that takes place at KCD. It costs about $35. Kentucky Go Digital, which you could attend for free as a Bellarmine student. And then the KISTI conference that takes place at the Galt House each year. So keep those on your radar. Tech problems, right? That's not, again, as big a problem as it once was, but it still is. And really what changed that was Web 2.0, right? Moving everything off of your hard drive and into the cloud. And of course, if you're not familiar with what the cloud is, and you can learn about it. I put a podcast, I think maybe the first week, about what explains what the internet is, and I think it talks about the cloud in there also. But clouds is just some server in some nondescript industrial park, in Idaho, that has thousands of servers in it, and essentially what that did was take the responsibility off of you. When I started using technology, one, so many technologies were new and were in beta stages that you would hear the term that it was very unstable. A lot of technologies were very unstable. They would crash on you all the time. That's generally not the case. It can be, especially with a lot of apps, because they're being developed kind of on the fly. But they're much more stable. And two, when you have problems, back in the past, if you had a problem, it just didn't work for days until you figured it out, or having somebody from the tech department come and figure it out. Now, when you have a problem, the owner of Kahoot fixed the problem. You don't have to worry about the problems. Maybe it is down for an hour, okay, but somebody else is fixing it, and it's fixed pretty expeditiously. Okay, so additional problems: outdated technology. Smartboards are a perfect example of that. They're being phased out, but they're there. A lot of them, the software hasn't been upgraded on. Just, where you have computers in your classroom that are so old they won't run the software. You get the idea. And then just a lack of support, and that lack of support can come from your administration or your school, and that takes us right into our second order barriers: teachers' beliefs about technology. So we see an old calculator right there on the right. So it could be teachers' beliefs about technologies. And I still have students. I can think of one about 2 years ago who was an English teacher, and it wasn't she was a Luddite, and I have had a Luddite, a couple of years ago, who just didn't think her kids should have technology. Even though she was a teacher, she taught at collegiate. She didn't think her kids should have technology. She was not a fan of technology. So, but some of it just could be that whole sort of idea, belief about sort of that you hear about. Calculators, kids can't do math because of calculators was, that common theme at one point in time. Today, it could be something like, because kids are texting all the time, they can't write as well as they used to. Well, let me tell you, research on that, not only does it not prove that that's a fact, it actually disproves that that's a fact. There's a great book called Texting the Great Debate, which says that the kind of texties that we see kids using, and we don't see it as much as we once did, but we do still see it. We don't see it as much because phones now autocorrect. But the kind of texties that we see has been around forever in linguistics. That book is actually written by a linguist. And so we don't see, that's not true. And there's been research on it that shows that kids are able to code switch between texties and the way that they write in a text and the way that they write on a paper, just like people code switch if they're bilingual. They know the difference between, I should have that I capitalized when I'm writing a text and when I'm writing a paper, or they're just making a conscious choice not to. And that's what the research says. That's not just me. They're just being lazy about editing and revising. Beliefs about computers, established classroom practice, unwillingness to change, teachers' attitude, the school climate and culture. A lot of that is the principal sets that vision for technology integration and establishes that climate and culture. That can be a barrier, and we definitely see that at times in schools. Lack of motivation, and then the lack of self-efficacy, which that comes from, and I just noticed that I've got Otter Britt Leftwich, his name's spelled wrong there. That comes from the second article. So just teachers not having confidence in their ability to integrate technology. So those are our barriers. Just want to make sure that you're aware of those, that they are still in existence. That may not be your experience, but that doesn't mean that they're not the case. One thing that we need to realize is we're in a large metropolitan school system here. If you're Jefferson County, if that's what we're talking about. Obviously, if you went to a private school, and Jefferson County, Louisville is an anomaly as it relates to private schools. You're not going to go to many states in the country that the third largest school system in the state is a private school system. In Kentucky, it's the Archdiocese. And obviously, they're going to have more technology. So that's not really a snapshot of the real world of education. If we were to drive an hour either way outside of Louisville, maybe with the exception of to Cincinnati, you're going to see the technology integration drop off pretty quickly. And that includes not only access, but teachers, efficacy, and attitude towards it. All right, with that said, that's the end of my discussion of traditional barriers, and I hope that you found it somewhat useful.